on to our next Roman source, Tacitus. He wrote Annals of Imperial Rome in 115 AD. It contains the history of the Roman Empire from 14 through 68 AD. So, what does Tacitus have to say about Jesus? Long story short, the emperor had arranged for arsonists to start fires in the city because he wanted to institute some new building plans, and there were some old buildings in the way. Unfortunately, the citizens suspected Nero was responsible for it. In an attempt to shift the blame, and according to Tacitus, Nero used the Christians as the scapegoat. Dr. Bart Ehrman writes, "The populace at large was willing to believe the charge. Tacitus tells us because the Christians were widely maligned for their hatred of the human race, and so Nero had the Christians rounded up and executed in a very public, painful, and humiliating ways. Some of them, Tacitus indicates, were rolled in pitch instead of flame while still alive to light Nero's gardens. Others were wrapped in fresh animal skins and had wild dogs set on them, tearing them to shreds. It was not a pretty sight." With this background in mind, Tacitus writes, "To suppress this rumor, Nero fabricated scapegoats, and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians, as they were popularly called. Their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius's reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate." Here we see the name Christ, but not the name Jesus. But it seems plainly obvious here that Jesus is the one being referenced here. Ehrman writes on this point and says, "He was called Christ. He was executed at the order of Pontius Pilate, and this was during the reign of Tiberius. Moreover, this happened in Judea, presumably since that was where Pilate was the governor, and since that was where Jesus' followers originated. All of this confirms information otherwise available from Christian sources, as we all see." Tacitus was most likely born somewhere in the 50s AD. We can know this with a degree of certainty because he was appointed to the quaestorship during Titus's short rule, and 25 was the minimum age for the position. So how did Tacitus know what he knew? Tacitus had heard of Jesus, but he was writing about 85 years after Jesus would have died. By this time, the Gospels would have already been written, and so it seems like Tacitus is basing his work here on the word of others rather than detailed research. In another attempt to be as intellectually honest as possible with this, Tacitus seems wrong in one thing that he says. He calls Pilate the procurator of Judea, but we know from an inscription discovered in 1961 in Caesarea that as governor, Pilate had the title and rank of prefect. Procurator dealt with revenue collection while prefect dealt with military forces. This detail could seem to suggest that Tacitus didn't do much research and instead based his information on what was spreading around in the streets. So whether this is a simple oversight by Tacitus, a mistranslation, or evidence of Tacitus gathering info based on hearsay is anyone's guess. On the other hand, this could have originated from one of Pilate's reports to the emperor, which Tacitus would have access to. Although this view to me seems unlikely, Pilate is known in the New Testament, Philo, and Josephus as having a reputation among his subjects for being unjust and cruel, and it is unlikely that he would send a report to the emperor detailing what would come to be known as one of his most notable failures. Even if Pilate had drawn up a report of Jesus' trial, it would have gone into the closed Imperial archive and not have been available to Tacitus or any other writer. In my study, it seems like the most likely source of Tacitus' information about Christ is Tacitus' own dealings with Christians, directly or indirectly. Still, though, despite all this is still evidence that a Christ figure may have existed. For one, if it was factually wrong that Jesus was crucified, we would expect Tacitus to have been corrected. So the fact that he made this reference and that it lasted seems to be evidence of its validity. I want to add another passage. Tacitus writes, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. Thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of the charioteer, or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. So obviously this is why I wanted to cover the Christus translation issue in the last part, because here Tacitus uses the word Christus as well. According to different scholars like Voorst, Habermas, and many others, from this report we can find the following information. Christians were named for their founder Christ. Christ was put to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from AD 13 through 37. His death ended the superstition for a short time, but the superstition broke out again, especially in Judea, where the teaching had its origin. His followers carried his teachings to Rome. When the Great Fire destroyed a large part of the city during Nero's time, the emperor placed the blame on Christians who lived in Rome. Tacitus reports this group was hated for abominations. These Christians were arrested after pleading guilty. Many of them were convicted for hatred of mankind. They were mocked. They were tortured, including being nailed to a cross or burned to death. Because of these circumstances, some people had compassion for the Christians. And so it seems we have another great addition in our quest to answer, did Jesus exist?